Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing while listening. Picture yourself standing on the muddy banks of the River Blackwater in Essex on a humid August afternoon in the year 991. The air is thick with the salt of the estuary and the metallic tang of impending violence. On one side of the tidal causeway stands Beernoth, a proud English nobleman with a shield wall of local farmers and hardened warriors. On the other, separated by the rising water, waits a fleet of dragon-headed ships, led by Vikings, who haven't come for land, but for portable wealth. The Vikings make an offer that will echo through English history: pay us, and we'll leave. Beernoth, driven by a fatal overconfidence, refuses. He lets them cross the ford to fight. Hours later, he's dead, his army is broken, and the road to England's heartland lies open. In the aftermath of this disaster, known to history as the Battle of Malden, the English government made a pragmatic decision that would change the economic landscape of Europe. They didn't keep fighting. They handed over 10,000 pounds of silver to buy peace. This payment marked the beginning of the Danegeld, a phenomenon that would drain the nation's treasury. It would also spark fierce academic debates 1,000 years later, and ironically, lay the foundation for the most efficient tax system in the medieval world. In the late 10th century, England was ruled by King Ethelred II, a man whose nickname Unready is a poor translation of an Old English pun meaning ill-advised. Ethelred presided over a wealthy centralized state, but he faced a threat unlike any in generations. The Viking fleets of the 990s weren't small bands of raiders, but massive organized armies capable of coordinating strikes across the entire coast. The logic was cold and calculated. The cost of a ravaged countryside, burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and dead subjects was often higher than the cost of the tribute. So, in 991, they paid 10,000 Roman pounds of silver. It was a staggering sum, roughly 3 tons of precious metal. But paying an extortionist rarely makes them go away forever. The Vikings returned in 994, this time led by kings like Sweyn Forkbeard and Olaf Tryggvason. They besieged London, and while the city held, the surrounding lands burned. To save the country, Ethelred paid again, 16,000 pounds this time. The payments escalated with terrifying speed. By 1002, the price of peace had risen to 24,000 pounds. In 1007, it was 36,000. By 1012, following the brutal sack of Canterbury, the English handed over a colossal 48,000 pounds of silver. These were massive transfers of capital that required a sophisticated administrative machine to collect. The English state had to mobilize its sheriffs and reeves to assess land, collect coin, and transport tons of silver to the waiting ships. The entirety of one of Europe's most advanced economies had been hijacked for the sole purpose of paying off the Norsemen. This massive hemorrhage of wealth has led historians to a fierce debate about just how onerous the Danegeld was. For a long time, the prevailing view, championed by scholars like M.K. Lawson, was that the Danegeld was a crushing burden that impoverished the English people. Lawson, in his 1984 paper on the topic, noted that the sheer volume of silver mentioned in the chronicles was over 100,000 pounds in total. He further noted that this would have represented a significant percentage of the nation's gross domestic product. In an agrarian society where 90% of the population worked the land, extracting this much wealth would have been devastating. It likely forced peasants to sell their land or sell themselves into serfdom just to pay their share, fundamentally altering the social structure of England. However, another school of thought, led by historians like John Gillingham, offers a fascinating counter-narrative. Gillingham suggests that we shouldn't just look at the cost, but at the capability. The fact that England could pay these astronomical sums repeatedly without collapsing is evidence of extraordinary economic resilience. It suggests that England was vastly wealthier than its neighbors, flush with silver from the wool trade with the continent. Gillingham also floated the idea that the chroniclers might have exaggerated the sums to criticize the king. In essence, they may have simply been throwing out increasingly large numbers to paint a picture of complete collapse by the English state. However, he also states that even if the numbers are accurate, the ability to collect them proves the efficiency of the English bureaucracy. Interestingly, he notes that later monarchs looked back on the Danegeld not with shame, but with envy, seeing the power to levy such a tax as a precious jewel in the royal crown. We don't just have to rely on written chronicles to understand the scale of this wealth transfer. The evidence is buried in the ground, and archaeology tells a vivid story. Huge hordes of Anglo-Saxon coins have been found across Scandinavia, potentially containing more English silver coinage than has been found in England itself. One of the most telling details comes from the coins themselves. Many English pennies found in Sweden bear peck marks. These are small nicks made by a knife. In England, in the time of Ethelred, the king's coin was accepted at face value, and you didn't question the image of royal authority. But the Vikings didn't care about Ethelred's regal face. They lived in a bullion economy where value was determined by weight and purity. They pecked the coins to check that they were solid silver all the way through. These little scars are physical proof of the Danegeld, evidence of money moving from a trust-based economy to a skepticism-based one. Runestones in Sweden even boast of men who took the Danegeld in England multiple times, carving their financial success into granite for eternity. The story of the Danegeld has a surprising twist. In 1012, after the massive payment of 48,000 pounds, the Viking leader Thorkel the Tall defected to Ethelred's side with 45 ships. To pay for this mercenary fleet, the government instituted a new annual tax known as the Heergeld, or army tax. This was a pivotal moment. The Danegeld transformed from a sporadic tribute paid to enemies into a regular tax paid to maintain a standing defense force. When the Danish king Canute eventually conquered England in 1016, he perfected this system. In 1018, he levied a record-breaking 72,000 pounds of silver from the nation to pay off his invasion fleet. After sending most of his ships home, he kept a smaller standing force funded by the Heergeld. For nearly 40 years, the English people paid an annual tax, creating a flow of revenue that made the English monarchy the richest in Western Europe. It wasn't until 1051 that Edward the Confessor abolished the Heergeld. Legends say he saw a devil sitting on the money chests and was moved by conscience, but it's more likely he simply wanted to curb the power of professional soldiers. When William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, he found a state with a unique capacity to tax its subjects. The Danegeld, and then the Heergeld, had forced the Anglo-Saxons to map their country's wealth in extreme detail. When William ordered the compilation of the Domesday Book in 1086, he was essentially conducting a massive audit of the Danegeld system. He wanted to know exactly how much his new kingdom was worth and who was liable to pay. The Norman kings revived the tradition, using it to fund expansion in France, proving that the administrative innovations born from the Viking crisis had long-lasting utility. In the end, the Danegeld was a tragedy for the generation that paid it. It stripped the country of its liquid capital and funded the very armies that eventually conquered it. But in the long view of history, it forged the English state. It necessitated a bureaucracy capable of assessing wealth and collecting revenue on a national scale. This was something no other European kingdom could match at the time. The silver may have flowed across the North Sea to buy weaponry and ships for further extortion, but the administrative steel remained in England. This government structure would endure long after the Viking longships had faded into the mists of history. In paying the price of peace, the English ironically accidentally bought themselves some semblance of a real bureaucratic state that would set them up for centuries of success. In the dark forests of medieval England, travelers once hurried through by daylight, wary of wolves lurking in the twilight shadows. At dusk, the distant howl of a wolf could send shivers through a village, a reminder that beyond the edge of the lamplight, untamed creatures lurked. These predators, feared and reviled, roamed the land for centuries, only to have their howls silenced forever by the close of the 15th century. The extermination of wolves in medieval England was no accident of nature, but a calculated human campaign to tame the wilds no matter what the cost. Wolves were an established part of Britain's environment long before the medieval era, having spread into the British Isles after the last ice age. By the early Middle Ages, they ranged across much of England, especially in the densely wooded regions. Archaeological finds and place names provide evidence of their presence. In Suffolk, the village of Woolpit got its name from Wolf Pit, referring to pits once dug to catch wolves. Anglo-Saxon records also mention wolves frequently. January was even dubbed Wolf Month in the Anglo-Saxon calendar, marking the season when nobles organized wolf hunts. One chronicler notes that in 957, King Edgar imposed an annual tribute of 300 wolf skins on the Welsh king. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, wolves had already been driven out of the more settled southern shires. They weren't totally exterminated, but remained most common in the wild forests of northern England and along the Welsh borders. After 1066, the Norman kings intensified anti-wolf measures. They not only continued the hunts, but also institutionalized them. Many nobles were granted lands on the condition that they keep the area free of wolves. For instance, William the Conqueror awarded the lordship of Ridsdale in Northumberland to Robert de Umfreville. In his charge, he specifically ordered him to defend that territory, quote, from enemies and wolves. Dedicated wolf hunters were employed by the crown, and there were typically no penalties for eliminating wolves regardless of social status. Early Plantagenet monarchs likewise supported wolf extermination through bounties, with a wolf pelt being worth up to 5 shillings. To put this in context, 5 shillings represented about 60 days of labor for a farmhand, so this was a huge sum at the time. This system unfortunately had the unintended effect of causing many dogs to go missing as well, in an attempt to cash in on these pelt bounties. For the English wolf, the 13th century marked the beginning of the end. In 1281, King Edward I, determined to rid his realm of wolves, issued an unprecedented edict ordering the total extermination of all wolves in England. He even appointed a royal official, Peter Corbett, to hunt down every last wolf across several counties along the Welsh marches. Local landowners were encouraged to assist in these efforts. Records even mention woods being deliberately burned to flush out wolf dens. The campaign under Edward I was largely effective. Reports of wolves became increasingly scarce after the 1280s. By 1290, one of the last known incidents of wolf damage, wolves slaughtering deer in a nobleman's forest, was noted as an extreme rarity. In fact, around the year 1300, an English scholar attempting to procure wolf carcasses for medical study had to import dead wolves from abroad. This extreme measure implies that finding a local wolf in England had virtually become impossible at this time. By the early 14th century, wolves had been eliminated from most of England, surviving, if at all, only in the wildest regions. Monks at Whitby Abbey, for example, paid for the curing of 14 wolfskins in the 1390s, suggesting a remnant population in the forests of northeast Yorkshire at that time. Land grants and offices with the duty of eliminating wolves persisted into the 1400s, potentially an indication that authorities still contemplated the possibility of survivors. As late as 1433, a minor nobleman was recorded holding an estate in Nottinghamshire, with his duty being the sounding of a horn upon the sighting of wolves. Historians are divided on what this task actually meant. A plain reading of the evidence indicates that this nobleman was on watch for the last of England's wolves. However, an alternative reading favored by other scholars suggests that this was actually intended to be a cushy land grant. After all, if it was known that there was no wolves there, giving someone an estate and telling them to blow a horn if they see one is perhaps the easiest duty to discharge. Still, another reading suggests that the nobleman was owed a familial obligation, but wasn't generally seen as being competent. In essence, you get to be the head wolf watcher in the area, and you can't screw it up, because there's no actual wolves to watch anyway. Popular legend claims that the very last wolf in England was slain at Humphrey Head in the 14th century, though the accuracy of this tale is uncertain. What is clear is that by the end of the 1400s, wolves had vanished from England. The eradication of wolves was driven by a confluence of practical concerns and deep-seated cultural attitudes. Foremost was the protection of livestock. As agriculture expanded, especially sheep farming for the lucrative wool trade, wolves came to be seen as economic enemies. By the Middle Ages, the wool industry was vital to England's wealth, and wolves that preyed on sheep were deemed devilish predators, undermining prosperity. And I don't mean this in the modern metaphorical sense. I mean that they were actually perceived as agents of the Dark Lord, accosting the prosperity of the godly English. Wolves were also perceived as a danger to human life, though actual attacks on people were probably infrequent. Still, tales of wolves attacking travelers or children stoked fear, and there were tales of manhunters with high body counts stalking the countryside. Such stories, whether true or not, reinforced the view of wolves as a menace that had to be eliminated. Religious and folkloric beliefs further amplified this antipathy. In medieval Christian symbolism, the wolf was often cast as a creature allied with the devil, preying upon the innocent. Clergymen frequently warned of wolves in sermons, both as literal predators and as metaphorical agents of Satan. To the medieval mind, the wolf represented the untamed wilderness and chaos lurking beyond the village walls, essentially the opposite of orderly human civilization. This mindset was even codified in law, and in Anglo-Saxon England, a person declared an outlaw was branded a wolf's head. This meaning they were no longer protected by law and could be slain as freely as a wolf. In fact, eliminating wolves was thus framed as a virtuous duty, synonymous with protecting one's community. Because of this, the authorities offered the pardoning of minor crimes upon the presentation of a pelt, and local religious institutions even offered up spiritual rewards. Notably, in modern times, there is renewed interest in bringing wolves back to England's wild places. The very idea of reintroducing these long-absent predators, now recognized as important for ecosystems, stands in stark contrast to the medieval mindset that celebrated their eradication. A hidden cave on a remote island filled with medieval coins and weapons might sound like pirate lore, but in Australia's far north, such a legend is more than fiction. The story of the Marchinbar Island coins began when an Australian soldier discovered a handful of centuries-old coins buried in the sand, a find that has baffled historians for decades since. In 1944, Air Force pilot Maury Eisenberg was stationed at a remote post on Marchinbar Island in the Wessel Islands of the Northern Territory. At the time, the Wessel Islands were a dangerous, largely uncharted frontier where some believed Japanese soldiers may have infiltrated. But Eisenberg wasn't concerned with such matters, and while fishing on the beach one day, he spotted coins glinting in the sand. He scooped up 9 coins, marked the spot on a map, and put them in a tin. The coins sat forgotten for 35 years, until 1979, when Eisenberg had them examined in Sydney. Amazingly, 5 of the coins were identified as coins from the medieval Kilwa Sultanate in East Africa. The other 4 were Dutch East India Company coins from the 17th and 18th centuries. 2 of the corroded Kilwa coins recovered on Marchanbar Island were dated to around the 12th century and were clearly inscribed with Arabic script. The coins were the oldest foreign artifacts ever found in Australia, potentially upending conventional thought about Australian contact with the wider world. Kilwa Kisiwani was a wealthy Swahili trading port in East Africa that produced its own copper currency in medieval times. Finding its coins on an Australian beach was unprecedented, and outside Kilwa's homeland, only a single coin had been discovered in Arabia. Eisenberg's stash also included those 4 Dutch coins dated from 1690 to the 1780s. These Dutch coins have turned up on Australian shores before, but usually much further west. Finding them on this remote northern island alongside medieval African coinage from prior to the discovery of Australia by outsiders was completely unexpected. This odd mix of old coins raised a question. How did they end up on Marchanbar Island, a long uninhabited place far off known trade routes? Researchers have proposed a range of ideas to solve the riddle of the Marchanbar coins. One possibility is that they're evidence of direct contact between indigenous Australians and seafaring traders from the Indian Ocean centuries ago. Kilwa was part of a vast network of commerce across the Indian Ocean, so it's conceivable that African or Arab sailors ventured farther east than previously thought. In 1550, a Portuguese writer noted that the port of Malacca, in Malaysia, had resident merchants from places as far afield as Kilwa and Cairo. The writer mentioned that these communities had been established there for centuries, bolstering the credibility of the idea that the coins came directly from these traders. Perhaps a ship from those routes was blown off course or fleeing pirates and wrecked on the Wessel Islands, leaving the coins behind well before any recorded European contact. Another theory points to early European mariners. A Portuguese ship in the early 1500s could have brought the coins. The Portuguese sacked Kilwa in 1505 and reached Timor by 1514. Some experts argue they likely continued eastward and might have landed on Australia's northern shores, depositing coins and other relics along the way. Interestingly, Aboriginal lore recounts that white men with shining armor came from the sea, and even speaks of a cave in the Wessels filled with coins and weapons. This is possibly a cultural echo of an encounter with Europeans prior to its official discovery by Westerners. A third explanation credits Asian mariners and indigenous exchange. In the 18th centuries, fishermen from Sulawesi, now in Indonesia, regularly visited the region to trade with the local populace. It's believed that they occasionally stopped at the Wessels for shelter and fresh water. They might have given out old coins as tokens of friendship and goodwill, or perhaps as payment for goods. Indeed, Dutch copper coins from the 1600s have been found in Aboriginal camps, presumably left by Indonesian visitors. Some historians believe it's possible that vintage Kilwa coins were also circulating in the spice ports of the Indonesian archipelago as currency. This offers a very reasonable explanation for how the African coins became intermixed with the Dutch coins. Notably, in the last couple of decades, Chinese coins and other foreign coins have also been found in the region. This suggests that the ocean-going traders of the Indonesian archipelago may have been much more active in Australia than previously thought. However, very few archaeological surveys have been conducted in northern Australia, and the territory is vast. Further discoveries may provide additional support for the theory of further Indonesian involvement, or perhaps from African traders based out of one of these ports. Whether they washed ashore from a medieval Arab or African shipwreck, were left by Portuguese sailors, or came via Indonesian traders, the truth behind the Marchenbar coins remains elusive. However, the discovery is reshaping how we view Australia's early history. Outside exploration of the continent is traditionally thought to have begun with Dutch sailors in 1606, while Indonesian traders came by the 18th century. The Marchenbar coins, however, potentially hint at contact that predates those encounters, perhaps by several centuries. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon if you really want to take your support to the next level and you're in the financial position to do so.